In my investigation into the assassination of JFK?
You found the evidence you were looking for.
Yes, I have proof. It's right here in my pocket. It's big, honey, really big. It goes all the way to the White House.
Do you want me to hold it for you?
No, it'll be safe right here. I'm in a jet. What could go wrong?
Hey, greetings, everyone. You're listening to the podcast. So there I was. This is episode 14, entitled Happy Birthday, Yogi. We've had some frightening tales so far, but Fig, this has got to be one of the craziest things I've ever seen or heard in aviation. What say you?
I was terrified listening to the firsthand account of this story. And what a great story, and what a perfect title. Happy birthday. Yeah.
And not only was it Yogi's birthday, it was his 100th trip. He became a Centurion on this recovery back aboard the USS Lincoln that day. Probably the most memorable recovery of an aircraft on board an aircraft carrier in naval aviation history. And I am not being hyperbolic when I say that. This is nuts.
It is nuts. And I remember when it happened because we all saw pictures of it. I thought to myself back then, that's crazy. And
right.
How lucky are we to be able to talk to those guys today and hear them tell their story. What a great story.
Yeah, and it was fun to catch up with them and meet them and learn of their story. And they also gave some credit to Nasty, who was the paddles that day to wave them back aboard the ship. That was interesting to hear Nasty take command of an aircraft carrier and tell the captain not once, but 3 times to straighten out that he would take the wind. We'll include that audio.
That's unprecedented,
right?
Unprecedented.
Yeah.
And that is also just another piece of this story that makes it so incredible.
So, no further hesitation. Here we go, folks, with Happy Birthday, Yogi.
So there I was. So every great aviation story begins.
Well, welcome everyone. This is Fig from Kansas City, joined by my co-host. Repeat.
Now I'm not even going to try. Repeat here from Dubai. Greetings, everybody. Just, butchering the language. It's what we do here. So this week,
of a tradition.
This week, speaking of traditions, we've broken our tradition of having one guest on. We've got 2 guests on. And if you've listened back to the episode that we had with Sheriff, I asked him a question if he knew Yogi. So he says, yeah, I was in that squadron. I know Yogi. Yogi, welcome. You're coming to us from Atlanta today, right?
Yeah, just outside of Atlanta, Peachtree Corners. Yep.
Great. What was your background in aviation? How'd you get involved? And
my dad was a P2V pilot before I was born, and then he flew for Eastern. So I was, I grew up airplanes. When I was 13, I got glasses, and my first thought was I'll never be a naval aviator because I knew you needed perfect vision. And then senior year of college, I was just talking to the recruiter, and he said, have you ever thought about being a bombardier? And I'm like, sure. And I figured it's as close as I'm going to get, right? As close to my childhood dream, right? And I was actually in this special program. It was a reserve program where I was 2 years of training, and then I was supposed to go become a weekend warrior. And so I was guaranteed the A-6. I was guaranteed to be a bombardier. It wasn't, something where I was going to go through training and get assigned wherever. So that sounded awesome to me. And so I joined up and did aviation officer candidate school in Pensacola, Florida, and flight school, and then into the RAG at VA 128.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
I got a question, Yogi.
Sure.
this program. They sold it to you as 2 years active duty, and then you could do the rest of the reserves in the A-6.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
What
Yeah,
was it?
absolutely.
What was the name of that program? Do you recall?
OSAM, OSAM, OSAM program.
All right.
You sound familiar?
That's awesome.
No, it was a very small program. And then I actually told Repeat this when we connected. I was in the RAG and I'm flying A6s, we're riding in A6s up through the Cascade Mountains, and it's, late fall, early winter. So there's snow on the mountains, and we're flying low levels through these mountains. I'm like, damn, this is fun. So I had earned a regular Navy commission from Aviation Officer Candidate School. So I took it, and that's how I wound up in a fleet squadron, because I wasn't supposed to be in a fleet squadron. I was supposed to go straight from the RAG to the reserves, and I changed my mind, as my wife reminds me periodically.
So you didn't have to go through all the things you went through.
But that's right. I didn't have to go through any of that. So, but it wouldn't have been nearly as much fun.
Right. No kidding.
Awesome.
So just real quick, my recollection is we had another guest on a previous episode who talked about riding in the P2. That was the P2 Neptune, right? And it had both a prop and a jet engine on it. It was anti-sub.
He was just in the prop.
Oh,
he was never in the jet. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Interesting.
Is that Chaz Repeat?
Yeah, that was Chaz. He was riding around in Indiana. Okay. He wound up changing over to the Navy. He was going to do the Marine Corps thing, and someone talked him into going Navy. So, all right,
smart man.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, I got to say, I'll give the Navy this credit. First of all, we all wear the Navy wings of gold. But the Navy also, when you're an aviator, you're an aviator. You aren't a grunt first. You aren't humping a rifle through the woods and doing all that stuff. That, generally speaking, sucked. So, all right. And also joining us from Guam today is Master. Welcome, Master. Tell us about your background. How'd you get into naval aviation?
Someone like Keith, I remember when I was a kid, my dad making models airplanes he used to fly. He was enlisted combat air crew back in the 50s. So he flew on a Grumman Guardian, which I guess was the largest single-engine piston-driven airplane to fly on and off aircraft carriers. But he was a radio operator and electrician by trade, I guess. It was that was back when the radars were so big that the airplanes had to operate in pairs. One was the Hunter that had the radar and took up the entire payload of the airplane, and then the Killer had the weapons. But he told me stories about these airplanes that obviously hadn't been in the fleet forever, and bases he had been stationed at that no longer existed. And so I remember thinking, wow, this guy must really be old. And of course now I am my dad.
Right.
I went to the Merchant Marine Academy and decided that I was going to go into the Navy. I wanted to be in a flight slot, not a driving boat slot. And I managed to get a flight slot while I was at Kings Point, went active duty in '86, and down in Beeville, Texas. Of course, it doesn't exist anymore. And then up to Whidbey to fly A6s that don't exist anymore.
Yeah, right. The airplane's gone. But Beeville's a federal prison now. That's my understanding.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Crazy.
Yeah. No kidding. So the Merchant Marine Academy, I actually had a flight student when I was teaching in Harriers, and we were gone up to Plattsburgh for vertical landing practice. The nice thing about Plattsburgh was it had a concrete runway, and the Air Force had huge water tankers that we used for water injection on the engines. And we could load those airplanes up with water a whole lot faster than we could at the Marine base. And it was cooler temperatures, allowing us to do more hover practice. And we're flying back south down to Cherry Point, and we're passing over the big port there in New York and New Jersey. And I look down and I see this dock sticking, looked like a half mile out into the water. And I noted it. He goes, "Oh, that's a super tanker port," and started rattling off all this stuff about super tankers. I'm going, "How do you know this stuff?" "Well, I went to the Merchant Marine Academy, and that's how I got my commission." And I went, the what? I had never heard of it. And I still think that's one of the best kept secrets. So how'd you find the Merchant Marine Academy?
I was in California. The last place I lived there, my dad worked at the Forest Service. We moved around a lot. And I went to 3 high schools and couldn't tell you how many elementary schools. But the last place I lived was in Benicia, which is right across from Vallejo, and California State has a California State Maritime Academy there. So I looked at that, thought that was kind of interesting, found out about the federal one. But yeah, it's like you said, nobody knows about it. It's a really well kept secret.
Yeah, and a commissioning program, so that's cool. So I interrupted you. Sorry. After Beeville, you selected A-6s.
Yep.
And where did that take you?
West Coast, up in Iraq, and then VA-95. I joined them on cruise. Flew out to the Philippines and got in a cod and went out and joined them. They were, like I said, Enterprise. It was the Enterprise's last cruise before it got refueled. So we ended up going all the way around the world and dropped it off on the East Coast. And then back to Whidbey, and that took us out of our normal rotation. We ended up picking up the Abraham Lincoln out of the yards and brought it down around South America because obviously it wouldn't fit through the canal off to the West Coast. And then Gulf War I broke out, and then we headed out on the Lincoln cruise for the maiden cruise of the Lincoln to relieve all the carriers up in the Gulf that fought the war.
Okay. Wow. Now, you mentioned something there called the COD. Explain what the COD is, please.
COD stands for Carrier Onboard Delivery, and it brings people, parts, and most importantly, mail out to the aircraft carrier.
And so my only thought about the COD is that probably the only thing more terrifying than landing an airplane on an aircraft carrier is riding in an airplane landing on an aircraft carrier.
You get used to it.
Yeah. Well,
you get used to it, right? Yeah. As a BN, you get used to it.
Right, but at least you have an ejection seat handle and can see what he's doing. Whereas in the COD, you're just a blind rat in the back. I'm sorry, that's terrifying.
Right.
So,
don't those seats face backwards?
They do.
Yes, they do.
They do.
No windows, facing backwards.
Taking a cat shot in the back of a COD is also quite interesting as well. So.
Oh gosh, please no, never. So, all right. So as a BN, you got used to not having the stick in your hand for takeoff and landing, but you could at least see what was going on. When did you two first meet, and did you fly together as a team regularly, or?
I joined the VA-95 shortly before we took the Lincoln around South America, and they had me paired with a more senior guy first, Diamond Dave Horton, and flew with him for couple of months, and then I don't know, Mark, when do you think we got paired up? Was it right before cruise? It was at least a few months before cruise, right?
Probably during workups for the cruise, because if I remember correctly, they pair crews up for workups, so you get used to working together before you go on cruise.
Yeah, so I'd been in the squadron not even a year at that point when we got paired up.
Okay, and so. Is it 100% of the time, or
hard crew pairs?
No, you would get paired with somebody and you do your training in order to do the night low levels, but you could be paired with anybody else. Okay. If you're doing night low levels, they want you to work with the same person, and then after several months, you have a senior pilot and a junior BN, and then 6 months later, whatever, they'll rotate it. They'll have two kind of mid-range, a pilot and BN, and then a senior BN and a junior pilot. But no, you could fly with it. You could fly with anybody.
Okay. But most of the time, I guess they wanted a majority of the time guys working together so you could kind of finish each other's thoughts for lack of a better. Okay. And
the night low level in the A-6 was quite the epitome of teamwork. And so they, you really had to kind of work together in order to do a night low level in the A-6.
Okay.
Can you describe what that's like? What's that mean? Because pretend I have no clue what you're talking about.
Okay. Well, we sat side by side, pilot on the left, BN on the right. We had no night vision goggles. We didn't have GPS at the time. The A-6 was an old aircraft. And the way I describe it to people is the pilot had great vertical vision. Like he could see the mountain in front of him is, X thousand feet above him or 1,000 feet above him, and very limited horizontal vision. And the BN had really good horizontal vision, but limited vertical vision. And so between the two of you, you had a good view of what was ahead of you. So we would fly a couple hundred feet off the ground and go down a mountain valley, and it's pitch black out, and we're just on radar and following the curves of the valley as you're making it through the mountain range. And my head was usually in the boot. I'm looking at the radar with a little thing to keep the light of the radar from bothering the pilot. But I can remember, looking out.
Would you give him steering cues?
Yeah. And we would be talking, and I'd say, hey, I see something ahead of me at, 2 miles. And he said, yeah, it's several thousand feet. And then I would say, okay, we got a right-hand turn coming up at 30 degrees in a mile or whatever. And it's all you brief it in advance. It's not like you're just kind of freewheeling it through the valleys. You brief it in advance, so you kind of know what's coming. So, but I can remember looking out one time in the training command, and we're in this mountain valley, and I look to my right, and it's just mountain as high up as I could see, like less than a half mile. And on the left side, a mountain as high up as I could see, and then ahead of me, a mountain as high up as I could see, because the valley curved. I'm like, I better get back on this radar and steer us around this curve.
And you're asking yourself at this point, why am I not selling shoes in a mall?
That's right.
Yeah. So what I want to do then is get into the event that brought your name to my attention. And I can do that by simply asking the question we regularly ask here on the show, which is, what is the scariest thing or the funniest thing that ever happened in naval aviation to you? And when guys get stuck a little bit, I always go, well, did you ever reach for the handle? Which one of you wants to start? Perhaps Yogi, because you lose perspective midway through the event, as I recall.
Right. Yeah. So I can talk the beginning and then after the aftermath a little bit. So there we were. So there I was in the A-6. There we were. Yeah. Right. And we just rounded the tip of India, heading towards the Persian Gulf. It was blue water ops at that point, and it was my 26th birthday. And
a daytime or nighttime, Yogi?
This was a daytime, early afternoon flight, and our mission that day was overhead tanker. Take off, take the excess fuel from the tanker, from the cycle in front of you, and then you hang out at 8,000 feet. Other planes take off, and some of them come up and get gas at the beginning of the flight and then go off and do their missions, while others go off and do their missions and then come get gas at the end of the flight for landing. So it's really busy at the beginning and end. And in the middle, it's just droning circles in the sky at 8,000 feet above the carrier. So we were about halfway through the cycle, about 45 minutes into it. And one of our drop tanks, the fuel wasn't transferring from the drop tank into the plane, and so therefore wasn't usable. And that's in the A-6 happened, I don't know, what do you say, Mark, 10% of the time? And the way you fix it is the pilot porpoises the plane. He moves the stick back and forth, and he just porpoises the plane, causing some negative G's, and it unsticks the valve. It's really no big deal. So Mark, he pointed at the fuel gauge, and we'd been watching it. And I shook my head, and I kind of made a motion with my hand for him to, move the stick. So he sped up a little bit, and he started to porpoise the plane. And then the weirdest thing happened. My helmet touched the canopy of the plane. And I literally, the first thought that went through my head was, I forgot to strap in my seat straps. And I'm floating, up and hitting the cockpit. I'm like, shit, right. I got to fix that. And then there was a bang, like a shotgun going off. And then there was a pop as the plane decompressed. And then I had 275 knots of wind in my face, which is interesting. And my first thought was that the top of the canopy had popped off. So I tried to duck down beneath the windscreen and beneath the dashboard, and I couldn't get out of the wind. So I thought, well, maybe the windscreen had popped out, and I'm getting all this wind. But still, I can't get out of the wind. And I'm still sitting in my seat, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And I look to my left, and where I should have seen Mark's right thigh, because we sit side by side. He's a little bit in front of us, a couple inches in front. Where I should have seen his thigh, I'm looking through the top of the canopy down at the top of his head. I am sitting in my ejection seat from the waist on up outside the plane. That's a sight I will never forget. Honestly, I will never forget that sight.
Did you think you were having an out-of-body experience or something?
it was just like, what the fuck? Well, then my helmet and oxygen ripped off, right? So then my helmet and oxygen ripped off. So now I truly have all this wind in my face. And I said to myself, I don't know what's going on, but I'm pretty sure something bad's happening. I'm going to eject, right? I could stand up in front of a board and say, this was a good decision. So I grabbed the handle between my legs and I pulled, and it wouldn't budge. It just wouldn't move. I'm like, shit. So then I tried to reach for the handles over the top of my head, but I'm a tall guy. I sit pretty high. Actually, a lot of guys in our squadron sat pretty high, but I sit pretty high. And I couldn't, as I'm reaching back for it, the wind is pulling my arms out of, so I can't grab it. So I just pull my arms to my chest. That's when I realized I can't breathe. I'm suffocating. So I'm kicking my feet.
Because so much wind was coming at your face?
Yeah. So it turns out, I get this right. It's either the Bernoulli effect or something, but when air goes by a small opening, it creates a vacuum, and it was sucking the air out of my lungs.
Oh, shit.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's
Low
like sucking gas from a car. Yeah. So it was cutting the air out of my lungs.
Couldn't get air in your lungs.
So I got my arms, across my chest. I'm kicking my feet because suffocating is uncomfortable. Yeah. And, they teach you they do all that aircrew training, and they show you what lack of oxygen is like. And I started feeling the lack of oxygen and the tunnel vision, and it starts to go dark. And the last thing I remember is saying, I don't want to die. And then black.
Wow. So, Master, pick it up from there.
I'm terrified right now. I know the outcome, but I'm terrified right now.
Master, jump in. I think it's appropriate for you here to say,
All right. So there I was, or this is no shit, or however the sea stories start. But kind of to put this whole thing in context.
Hey, no shit. This is
a bad day, but it was a bad day and a string of bad days for the air wing. So prior to that, we'd lost 3 airplanes and 2 flying days. The day before we pulled into Singapore, 2 Tomcats had a midair. Keith and I were out flying around, and we're going to get to do a ACM hop, which you never do, in the A-6 with another guy in our squadron, another crew in our squadron. And we're just turning in, and we get a call from Strike. And Strike is the guys that run everything on the aircraft carrier. Strike calls us up and says, your new mission is SAR, which, of course, got our attention, and they gave us a vector.
So search and rescue.
Yeah, Tomcat in the water. So this is bad. So we went zipping on over Buster, we call it, go fast, for an A-6. Headed over, and as we got to the spot, we looked down, and there was a kind of a oily residue spot down in the water, but there was an S-3 and a Hornet down there already. And one of the big dangers out there off the aircraft carrier when anything goes wrong is midair after the mishap, when everybody converges. So we checked, made sure everything was okay, and then we got the hell out of there. Came back and landed. And one of the airplanes ended up going into Singapore, missing 6 or 8 feet of its wing, and the other one went down in a ball of fire. The wing went through right behind the Rio, through the body of the Tomcat, and then went down in a ball of fire. Managed to punch out.
Oh, good.
So we went into Port Singapore. Hey, nobody died. It's bad, but it's not that bad. Pulled out. First day out of Singapore. Tomcat comes in for the break, and the wings didn't auto-program forward, so we stalled the airplane, beamed the LSO platform. Airplane went upside down. They hung with it until it went right side up. They punched. Airplane splashed in the water. We lost, like I said, 3 airplanes. Nobody died, so it wasn't that bad, but it was still concerning. It was definitely a black cloud hanging over the air wing. So Keith and I are scheduled to fly the next day. We're doing a tanker hop. And so everybody was on pins and needles and had their pocket checklist out, going through all their emergency procedures, just in case, because things were going badly. Went out, manned up. I still had the butterflies. We blast off. And like Keith said, we've been really busy at the beginning of the tanker hop. So we went up, did all our stuff, and on station. And I was finally starting to relax. And then we went to unstick the float valve. So from my perspective, a lot of nonverbal communication going on in the A-6 because you're sitting right next to the guy pointing at the drop tank, and he nods. We all know what we're doing. And the A-6 tankers were all the old airplanes. And it was not uncommon in the A-6 not only to have stuck float valves and drop tanks, but when you go to fix it, apply negative G to the airplane, and both generators drop offline. The canopy solenoid switch drops down to a neutral position, and the canopy opens up a little bit. So pretty common. So with all that in mind, pull back on the stick, add some power because you're sitting there at max conserve, not going very fast, no G available. Like he said, add some power, pull back on the stick a little bit, bunt the nose, and just kind of floated me in the seat. And I hear a bang, feel the cockpit depressurize, and kind of instinctively duck, look up, and I'm looking at the canopy bow, looking for it to be open like it always is, and it's closed. It's like, that's weird. Eyes go to the canopy switch. It's in the up position. Yeah, that's also weird. I wonder what's going on. And I looked right, and kind of the opposite of Yogi's perspective, I look right, expecting to see his head looking at me going, what the hell's going on? Because that's what I'm thinking. And instead of his head, I'm looking at his thigh. Like, well, that's not good. And I just basically followed it back up and over my right shoulder. And here's Keith looking down at me. He's got his helmet on, visor down, oxygen mask on. He's looking at me, and I can pretty much see the cartoon exclamation points and question marks coming out of his helmet as he's looking down. And, none of this makes any sense. It's like, well, why did he eject?
Right.
But if he ejected, why is he still here? So this is, it does not compute. And while I'm going
did
through
you
all
guys,
this,
hey, Master, did you guys have the command eject option so one of you could take both of you out? Or how did you get, what was your SOP for that?
I'm trying to remember when. I don't think that airplane had it.
That airplane did not. No.
Oh, okay.
No.
So Yo-Yo, you're on your own.
Yeah.
They were retrofitting. We had some planes in the squadron at that time with command eject, but before that there was no command eject. It was everybody's on their own, but that plane had not been retrofitted.
Okay. Yeah, so he's out there in the wind, and what is going on? And he got slammed down, and then he slammed back up in the wind blast. And I couldn't see his helmet and oxygen mask leave. It was there, and then it was just gone. It just disappeared. And that's when things started getting ugly.
Fast.
I always describe it as this old Schwarzenegger movie where he's on Mars, and he ends up outside the atmosphere. And what he looked like is his eyes are bulging out and his cheeks are puffed out, and that's what Keith looked like. I mean, you couldn't take your hands and stretch his eyelids out or his cheeks out as far as they were puffed out. And every once in a while he'd get slammed out, slammed back.
You guys were doing like 270-ish knots?
Yeah, maybe a little slower than that, but probably 250. But that's like 275 miles an hour, I guess. So we'll give him that number anyway, doing the math.
Yeah. Oh,
but so I really don't know what's going on here, but what I really need to do is slow down was my primary concern. So, pull the power to idle, got the speed brakes coming out, and A-6 design for battle survivability. You can't just throw the flaps and slats out. You isolate the hydraulics. So you have to throw a switch, de-isolate to get hydraulics running back out to the wings so you can do that. Got the flaps and slats going down. Thought, well, we're heavy. I got a lot of gas. I can get lighter if I dump this gas. So I started dumping gas again, just trying to get slow. And we weren't going all that fast, like I said. So we've got AOA, angle of attack indexers, that give you slow, on speed, and fast. And just it sits up in your peripheral vision you're looking forward from the pilot side. So I was slowing the airplane to on speed optimum angle of attack as the airplane got lighter and as the flaps and slats came out, just slowing it down as much as I can to try and take the load off of Keith. And still not exactly sure what was going on, but he appeared to be partially ejected was the term that made sense to me. Called up, and normally, again, you're on the frequencies you're on the tanker common frequency on one radio, and on the other radio, you're on the strike frequency, which is not what the air boss, the guy who's running everything around within 5 miles of the ship, and the guy who controls what's going on the deck is on. So I came up and said, mayday, 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 it's 515. My being's partially ejected, yada, yada, yada. And guy on strike doesn't care, and he can't really help. But to his credit, he understood that there was a problem, and he reminded me, hey, I need to be on another frequency as I Roger switched button 6. So the preloaded frequency on channel 6 on our radios. Okay. So I switched over and they did my whole spiel again. And the air boss, and I don't remember his name, but he was an unnaturally calm individual. And
of course,
for people that don't understand, you can't just come back and land on an aircraft carrier because they have to have everything out of the way and the wires ready and the ball turned on. All that stuff has to be done. And in mid-cycle, there are airplanes parked in your landing area, so you can't just come back and land. But there's a term that we use called emergency pull forward, meaning get everything out of the way so I can come back and land. And so I told the boss what was going on, and I told him, man, I need an emergency pull forward. And, in his very calm voice, Roger that, come on in.
Go ahead, 515. 515, my balloon is partially ejected. I'm going to need an emergency pull forward. What's your posit? I'm about 7 miles behind the ship. Come on in. Roger that.
And so this happened. We were about 7 miles of beam. The ship pointed aft, and I just started a big descending turn to try and get behind the boat. So here we are going down, and Keith is kicking, so I know he's still alive. So that was good. He's getting beat up, but he's not dead, so that's good. And somewhere in the descent, he quit kicking. And
oh boy,
yeah. So that was not good. And while I was doing everything else, I was periodically snatching views of him over my right shoulder. And when he quit kicking, like, oh shit, looked up, and Keith is up there. His arms are spread out to the side. It's called kind of a semi-crucifixion pose. His head was turned to the left, and his chin was basically on his left shoulder, and he was turning gray, and he wasn't moving.
Oh boy.
Based on everything that had been going on in the air wings, like, oh great, we finally killed somebody. He's my buddy, and he's sitting right here. I can touch him, and there's nothing I can do for him. So that was causing me a fair amount of stress. So I'd say, okay, you got to get yourself together, and I quit looking at Keith after that.
I'm 6 miles out. How's the deck looking?
Roger. You setting yourself up for a straight in there, 515? Understand you're setting yourself up for a straight in.
That's affirmative.
Roger. Understand your BN is still with you, is that correct?
That's affirmative. He's hanging out in the airstream. Just Peter's still in here.
Roger. 612, Tower, are you copying this? 616, Tower, are you copying?
Okay, that's fine.
Roger, close aboard starboard.
6 is right alongside the aircraft, so we'll follow him in.
Roger.
Continuing the descent down, and the boat, they just want to turn into the wind, right? They're boat drivers, and They know their job is to turn into the wind. Well, if there's no wind, they got to make their own wind, but they're turning into the wind, turning into the wind, turning into the wind. So they're messing with my lineup because I got to come back and land, and they're turning my landing area. So it's like, okay, hate you guys. Trying to get out around behind the ship. And, they've always find it interesting going to, how people behave or respond under pressure. You go to SEER school and watch how guys are under a whole lot of pressure there. And
Right.
When you first get in the military and you're going through, boot camp or whatever the version of that is, you watch people and how they react and things that stand out. And one of the things that stood out to me was before we left on cruise, I told Keith's wife, Michelle, hey, don't worry, I'll take care of Keith. And one of the things that hit me is, what am I going to tell Michelle? Because I gave her my word I would take care of this guy, and here he is. So this is, what am I going to do? This is not good. Don't want to deal with pissed off Michelle.
Yeah. You lied.
Oh.
Yeah. But we're coming down, and the LSOs got to the platform. Somebody gave them the call, and they were out there. And the guy who was the air wing paddles, we call him, air wing LSO, Nasty, great guy for a Tomcat guy. But he ended up going on. He was CO of the Reagan, and then he ended up getting, I think, at least 2 stars or something like that.
Nice.
But really fantastic guy. Again, always completely calm. And so he starts talking to me. Okay, bring it on in. And asking me how the airplane was handling. And I guess at some point I wonder why he's asking that, but kept going. I'll get back to that later.
Yeah,
Ship's still turning. And I'm still chasing, trying to get on lineup. And, we're near the equator, and we've been up at 8,000 feet, and we're about 4 miles behind the ship, and the front windscreen fogs over. It's like, Murphy's Law, here we go.
I hadn't even thought of that.
So,
yeah.
So I'm cussing. I turn the defog on max, and I'm like, I don't have all that much time. I'm going to have to unstrap where I can reach up and wipe this off so I can see. And about the time I'm getting ready to pop my upper coat fittings, which are what attach you to the parachute, the windscreen started to clear. It's like, okay, that's good. Boat's still turning. And then here the CAG paddles, the LSO, come up and tell the commander of the aircraft carrier, and nobody tells the CO of an aircraft carrier anything. You might respectfully ask him something, but you would never tell him anything.
Yeah.
And I hear the LSO tell the CO, hey, Captain, straighten out, I'll take the winds. And again, that may be the funniest thing I've ever heard. It's like, how does this guy walk with, anatomy that large that he tells the CO of the ship to do something? But
that's
finally
awesome.
The ship starts straightening out. It's like, okay.
Okay, bring it back to the left now. Boss, steady out right here. I'll take the wind. 39, slightly left.
Copy.
Okay, flying just a little bit low.
Roger.
Tower, steady out right here. Got 39, slightly port. I'll take the wind, Cap. Steady up.
But, touchdown, and you can feel the aircraft roll over each wire.
Right.
And normally after your main mounts hit the wire, it's, what split second before the hook should catch the wire. Well, I felt the airplane roll over the 1 wire, the 2 wire, 3 wire, and I finally felt the acceleration. Yeah. So the paddles was calling attitude.
Okay, just a little bit low.
Roger.
Just a little bit low. Come left. The paddles talk down. I got you. Come a little bit left. A little bit of right rudder. A little bit of right rudder. We're on center line. On center line. A little right for lineup. Don't go high. Don't go high. Attitude.
So you grabbed the 3 wire?
Yeah. So we ended up, hook skip 1, hook skip 2, cut the 3.
Because you were a flat attitude. Your hook wasn't grinding into the deck then, I guess. Is it?
Yeah, the A-6, if you didn't hold a fair amount of backstick pressure, it would hook skip the new airplanes, Hornets, things like that. They've fixed all those problems, but
right.
A-6 still had that problem. Yeah, caught the 3, and it was enough time for me to think as we're rolling across the wires, oh great, now I get to test the spool up time of the J-52s, the engines. as we dribble off the end of the deck on my really bad day, getting even worse. But finally felt the tug, say, okay, that's great. And it was the least deceleration I've ever felt in a trap with the with the powered. I don't like that.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, you didn't impale Yogi on the canopy shard, right? Which was your goal.
Yeah, we find out later. So he was, as the seat went through its sequence, and I don't know, we can get back in why it did that later if you want. But basically, as it did all these things, it disconnected him from the seat. So he was not attached to the airplane except for those parachute risers, which went around the head box of the ejection seat, and his parachute was wrapped around the tail. That's what basically pulled him out the top. Right. What happened? But yeah, he was not connected at all. So
it's terrifying.
At that point, the air boss say, "We got you. You're chocked," and then we're waiting for the shut the engines down after he told me I was chocked, and they they've got a cage, basically a platform that a forklift that can lift up and put people, medical people in this case, up close to the airplane.
You're chocked. You're chocked. Strike 616 banger. Slow banger. Roger, you got a visual? So you get banger. Roger, you got a visual 616. Roger, he's on the deck. Understand, both souls on deck. Affirmative. Roger. Make 616.
And 616 Tower, I'm going to be bringing you aboard the fantail for stuff here.
Roger. 616 banger.
Go ahead.
Be advised, no one in the water this time. There's no one in the water.
Roger, understand.
So we're waiting for those guys to get there, and I take my upper and lower handles and unstrapped, and was trying to make sure that Keith's seat was safe as well. And that's when he woke back up, and he was asking what was going on, and I was like, "Oh, we just landed, and think you're going to be okay, but you may not want to move around too much right now."
Oh my God.
Okay, so I got several questions.
Yeah.
Several questions. But first and foremost, from a pilot's perspective, I've seen pictures. As a matter of fact, I remember what was the name of the magazine that came out like once a month? Jumping Jehoshaphat bats. What were those boys?
Approach.
Yeah,
Approach. That's it.
So I remember seeing the pictures, and I read the article from back then, from your incident. Did you have any controllability, any hint at all, Master, that the parachute and lines were going aft and kind of wrapped around the tail?
I had absolutely no idea. I mean, actually, after they got Keith out and they put him on the bomb elevator and sent him down to medical, and they towed me out, and we pumped the canopy open manually as far as we could slide it back with his seat still up blocking the way, and me squeezing out. I never even looked back at the airplane. I didn't know until that night. I went down and looked at the airplane in the hangar bay, and that's when I first realized that the parachute had been wrapped around the tail. I had no idea.
And it wasn't just wrapped around the tail. I mean, when Mark was talking about the landing, if you watch the video, the parachute acted as like a shoulder harness for me. My shoulders never went forward when we landed. My head and arms flew forward, but my shoulders stayed pinned back to the seat. It was wrapped. The parachute was wrapped tight enough around the back end of the plane to keep me from flying forward, but not tight enough to interfere with his flight controls.
That's wild.
Wow.
I mean, how many things had to go right?
And that was your birthday. Was it not your birthday?
It was my 26th birthday. Absolutely.
And you made it special another way too, didn't you?
That's right. And it was my 100th carrier land, by the way, just as an aside.
Got to make your Centurion trap special.
That's right.
Oh, terrifying.
Okay. So the next question is, I know after they, actually, thank goodness they had an airplane and all the parts there to investigate what was the cause of the seat going up the rails.
You want to take this one, Mark?
Okay. The ejection seat that Martin Baker, that was also in the Tomcat, the Prowler, I'm not sure what else, other airplanes, but it sits in two channels that are mounted to the floor of the cockpit. And then there are rollers top and bottom on either side of the seat. And those four rollers, two on each side, slide into these channels, and that guides it down in where it sits. So it's actually free to move up and down these channels, except there's a piece of flat aluminum stock that comes out of the back of the cockpit wall there, and there was a hole cut in that, and it's a square hole rather than a round hole, and there's a bolt that goes through that piece of metal and into a basically a nut that's in the seat, and that keeps the seat from moving up and down vertically. Well, square hole, subject to fatigue cracks. There were cracks, and they call that hole the upper latch window. And so when we push negative, the top of that hole separated and allowed the seat to start traveling up the rails. And when it starts traveling up the rails, there's a striker pin or a firing pin that starts firing off the CADs, which are basically glorified shotgun shells that generate hot gas in order to make the seat do different things. And one of the first things it does is it fires the drogue weight, and there's a lead weight about, 6 inches long and about ½ inch in diameter that's attached to the drogue parachute. Well, when it fired that drogue weight, it blew it through the top of the canopy, which pulled the drogue parachute out, which pulled the main parachute out, which pulled Keith and the seat out, but it's not really designed to be going that fast, 230 knots, whatever it is we were doing. So parachute came out, billowed up, and then immediately failed and wrapped around the tail of the airplane. So that's why Keith got stuck out the top. Other interesting bits of trivia from that incident, the lanyard that fires the rocket motor that propels you away from the airplane is 35 inches long. So when it gets 35 inches up the rails, it fires the rocket motor, which would have been fairly bad in this situation.
Yeah.
But they went up, and there were witness marks on the rails, 35.0 inches, where Keith got crimped back and basically, broke out of the rails and kept him from moving farther. So he was right. What they call it, line stretch in parachute accidents. We were basically right at the point where it was going to fire, and it didn't. So we were quite lucky in that respect.
Something that comes to mind is that your height might have helped save you then, Yogi, because had you been a shorter guy, it might have had to travel further before pinning the seat. Wow.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, perhaps.
Wow. Because that's the line. You didn't cross the line, but you were as close to crossing it as you get without doing it.
If he was an inch shorter, it would have stretched that cable an extra inch. Boom, pow.
Man. Yeah, the leverage at that. Oh,
what a story.
Amazing. So what's the next thing you remember, Yogi?
Well, so before we get to that, because I do tell this story when people ask. So Mark kind of glossed over a couple of these things as he's coming into land, or as he called the ship. He says, "My BN is partially ejected." Right. A partial ejection is like being sort of pregnant. It just doesn't happen, right? It's you're either ejected or you're not.
Right.
And so they were confused, like what the hell? But they continued to do what they'd been trained to do, and turning into the wind is one of those things. But the boss came on at one point and said, "Understand your BN is still with you," and Mark's response was, "That's correct. He's hanging out in the airstream, just his feet are in the cockpit." And there were people that thought that meant my legs had been cut off and my feet were sitting in the cockpit while I was hanging out in the airstream.
Boy.
So, there was mass confusion on what was going on there. But I also want to echo what he said about about Nasty, the CAG paddles, calling the captain of the ship and just having the balls for a lieutenant commander to take over the ship. I actually stayed in touch with Nasty, got back in touch with him, I guess, when he was skipper of a carrier. And I told him how, whenever I tell the story, I mention that and how great that was. And he said every time that he talks, comes up with the one MC and says, getting ready for launch, whatever, he says he thinks about that call every single time. So, Nasty I will reiterate, Nasty was a great guy. So is a great guy. So I wake up and I got this funny view of the front end of an A-6, right? I'm hanging halfway out of the plane, looking at the front end, and we had taken off from the waste catapults that day. And when you stop on the 3-wire, you're sort of kind of in the general area of where you would start your catapult shot. And I'm like, did we not take off? Did something happen? And there's about 100 people on the deck looking up at me. And I'm like, what the hell? And then and Mark said, we landed, and then it all came rushing back like, oh shit, So at that point they had the forklift come up, and they had a couple of doctors and, medics standing on the little platform of the forklift. They had a seat technician, an AME, Petty Officer Picard, climb on and put the pins in the seat to save the seat, because, the ejection seat is just a series of explosions and rockets. Yeah. And they wanted to make sure that, while the doctors were dealing with me, that
everybody didn't go for a ride.
Well, you're going to fire off.
Exactly. So actually my first memory is hearing them saying, don't touch him until the seat's been saved. Like that's my first memory of waking up. Okay. So they saved the seat, and then the doctors started swarming over me. Of course, they were worried about my neck. They were holding me in a neck brace. They put me in a neck brace. And at some point I heard one of them say, he's bleeding out of his ear. So I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty sure bleeding out your ears is on the bad side of things.
Yeah. Good, bad. That's bad.
So right. I think I learned that in ER or something. Yeah. And it turns out I just had a little cut on the inside of my ear, and it had dribbled out. It was no big deal. So they took their time, and they got me out of the cockpit and into, one of those steel carry cages. And they put me on the weapons elevator and brought me down to the hospital floor. And they had 4 Marines there to carry me to the hospital. And I'll tell you now, my left arm had popped out of the socket from the wind, and then on the landing had popped back in. So I don't know if you've ever had shoulder injuries, but they suck really, really bad. So I'm lying on this, the metal stretcher cage thing with my arms folded across my chest, and the Marine who's carrying right by my shoulder, with every step his knee is hitting my elbow. Oh, and it's hurting. So I'm saying, okay, stop, ow, stop, okay, stop. And finally I just used my command voice. I said, halt, and they all stopped. I said, you're kicking my arm with every step and it hurts. Please stop. And I always say, hey, he was a Marine. I didn't tell him exactly what to do. So he reached down, grabbed my arm, moved it out of his way, and then proceeded to keep walking. So he solved the problem. I didn't give him clear direction on what to do.
I'm assuming that it was a lot of pain when he moved your arm for you.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah, it was quite a lot of pain, but he was no longer kicking it with every step. I can tell you that. So, so they take me to the ER, I guess, for lack of a better term, down in the infirmary, and they're working on me and taking X-rays of my neck and everything. And our corpsman, our squadron corpsman, is standing over me, and all he can say is, "Sir, you look like Jesus on an A-6." Because, like Mark said, when I came aboard, my arms were spread wide like that. So they X-rayed my neck. Neck was fine. And they're like, okay, well, the other x-ray machine's in the room next door. Go over there. I'm like, what, you're not going to carry me? I mean, I've just been through all this. So I shuffled over there. And like I said, my left arm had popped out of the socket and popped back in on the landing. My right arm, my shoulder, my bicep, and my forearm were paralyzed. They weren't working at all. So I could move my hand, I could move my tricep, but I couldn't lift anything like my arm or my hand or anything. And then of course everything from the waist on up was just bruised and hamburger and looking pretty nasty. And so I'm lying in the hospital bed that night, and I got my left arm strapped to my chest and my right arm in a sling, and some poor petty officer's feeding me, right, because my arms aren't working. And I remember thinking to myself,
join the Navy, feed the officers.
Exactly. And I remember thinking to myself, all things considered, not bad, right? I mean, I'll take it considering what it should have been. And, all my buddies came down and we were cracking up and laughing about it. And the guy who flew in 515 the night before, he was a little guy, and he's like, man, that would have killed me. And basically, no harm, no foul, right? I mean, I was alive.
Right.
Wow.
So that was
happy birthday on top of all of it, right?
That's right. That's right.
That's amazing. A couple of things that you point out there and you kind of glossed over is that one, it's the macabre sense of humor. You're sitting there joking about it a little while later, because some of that stuff you just have to laugh at it because it would terrify you otherwise, right? So,
well, I don't know if you can use this on the podcast, but the guy who was flying it the night before, as they were holding before pushing over to come land, he said what he always does, and he did the night before, was use the relief tube.
Okay.
And he was using the relief tube, and he said oftentimes his pilot would do a little bit of a negative G when he was doing that, just to mess with him a little bit.
Get him to piss on his shoes.
Exactly. And he's thinking, imagine if that had happened to him in the midst of a piss, right? Yeah. I mean, coming aboard with his dick hanging out,
What were you two doing up there?
That's just some of the like you said, the macabre humor that you've got to have to survive in that environment. So,
right. That, and then the other thing I noted was that your first impression was, quote, interesting, unquote. There you go. There's your typical naval aviator. That when things start going to shit, you don't panic. You just kind of go, all right, what's going on here? Look around. Paddles didn't panic. In fact, took command. Nicely done.
Took command of the ship for a second.
Yeah, exactly. Master didn't panic, kind of looked and went, well, shit, and the more you started to realize this is bad and it's distracting me, you went, okay, I'm going to turn around and fly the airplane. Got to do what I got to do. That's the hallmark of professional aviation. I'm so impressed.
So
I am too.
Mark deserves all the credit in the world. I think he skipped over a couple of things that I've heard him say over the years. He pulled the hook down like 12 times, just wanted to make sure the hook was, he hadn't forgotten that step. But, when you come in on an A-6 on airspeed, you're not that far from stall speed. I forget how many knots, but you're not that far from stall speed. And he's looking at me thinking, hey, this is disrupting the aerodynamics of the plane. I don't know what the stall speed is. When he came in for the landing, he was actually a little bit fast, because he didn't want to approach stall speed when he's coming in. So talk about keeping your head and thinking through, not just what are you doing, but why are you doing it? Those are some of the little things that just were amazing, that he could think about those things throughout the flight, when all that shit was going on.
Right.
I picked up on several details that he was talking about, but he didn't really come out and say it. For one, he kept the speed back, kept the descent rate going to try to alleviate the air loads on you, and the fact that he even forethought, hey, I'm going to consciously have the throttles at idle when we land and not go full power like you always do, to lessen the deceleration trauma on you, because he wasn't sure what was going to happen as far as you going forward.
Right.
Right. He had no way of knowing that you were securely snatched to the back of the airplane. He thought maybe you were going to be impaled on the jagged canopy.
Absolutely.
Kudos, boys. Nice job.
Yeah, absolutely. For non-aviators, he talked about stall speed. People think that refers to the engines. The stall speed, a stall in an aircraft is when the wing quits flying because there isn't proper airflow over the wing. That's referred to as an aerodynamic stall. And the airplane falls out of the sky. When you're at 300 feet, you have no hope of recovery before impacting the ground or the water. That's deadly, to say the least. But wow, nice job.
Gentlemen, that was a great story.
The one thing I will do, I'll put in the post on the website, so thereiwas.us, I will put the link to GallagherStory.com, which is where you can go and see pictures, hear audio of the conversation between Master and Paddles, and I think the boss is in there at some point too. And see, the pictures are just terrifying and impressive all at once.
They are terrifying.
I cannot imagine.
They are really terrifying. I remember seeing them in the Approach magazine thinking,
yeah,
holy shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So Sheriff replaced you, I think, in the squadron. Is that right?
No, I overlapped with him for a little while.
Oh, you overlapped. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He replaced one of the senior guys.
It was VA 95.
Yeah, VA 95.
Kind of the one page 2 Paul Harvey thing. Keith's first flight back in the squadron. I guess when you have nerve damage, which he obviously had, that's why his parts of his arm were paralyzed. He didn't tell you, but he went back to a Bethesda, and they ran for hopefully all your listeners have seen the Right Stuff, and they had the Nazi needle test, I think. Well, maybe that's Keith's term for it, but basically
that's my term for it. Yeah,
take a large gauge needle, stick it into your body, and run electrical current through it. Well, that's what they did to Keith, seeing what was wrong with his arm, and he said that was not a lot of fun. But his first flight back, so he's med down for 6 months because he had nerve damage. So 6 months passes, and it's time for Keith's first flight. We're back from cruise. We're there at Whidbey. Aircraft availability is not great, but they finally get an airplane for us, and we're going to go back out and get back in the saddle with Keith. We end up in the same airplane, 515.
Oh, no. Whoa.
Yeah.
No.
So we're just going to go out and go fly around and in the tanker, and not a lot you can do in a tanker, but it's a nice day. So we're going to go fly the VR 1355, which is fantastically scenic low level through the middle of the Cascades.
Okay.
But flying through the mountains like that, it's always kind of bumpy. So here we are zinging through the valleys and looking at the glaciers and what have you, but we're getting bounced around. And some of the times it's probably what would be moderate turbulence in an airliner. And so obviously we're getting, the negative G spikes. And I'm looking over at Keith, and Keith is trying to hold, 200 pounds of Keith and 400 pounds of ejection seat down, firmly planted to the floor, with both his arms grabbing onto the side of the airplane, trying to keep him from bouncing negative.
Right. I'm going to hold this seat in place.
That's right.
No matter what. Yeah.
So after that, I always briefed the pilot. I said, if you need to do negative Gs, do it. Obviously, safety of the aircraft, whatever. Try and warn me if you can, but don't do them just for fun. That was the only thing that kind of freaked me out was negative Gs. Gee,
I wonder why.
So yeah, exactly. And in the bomber version of the plane, I had the navigation computer between my legs, and it had a handle on it that the maintenance guys used to pull it in and out when they were repairing it. And I would fly around with my hand on that handle, just holding myself in, unless I needed my hand to do the job, unless I needed it. And that was my safety blanket to fly again for 18 months. Yeah.
Don't blame me in the least. That's awesome.
Yeah. Good procedure. Nobody could blame you for that.
Yeah.
No way.
So you stayed in 18 more months and then pulled the virtual handle, so to speak, to get out of the Navy.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Flying had lost its luster for me, a little bit.
Go figure.
And you know, the A6, they were getting rid of the A6, and you know, so I could get out. So I took the opportunity to get out.
Nice. Okay. And then did you stayed in them for a while longer, Master?
Yeah, when I rolled out of the Fleet Squadron, I went down and instructed in Meridian, Mississippi for a little over 3 years.
Okay.
Flying a TA-4 back when we still had those.
That was a great airplane.
What years were you there, Master? What year were you in Meridian?
93 to 96.
That's the years I was in Kingsville, 93 to 96. Okay. I for a very small amount of time, I was the TA-4 ATOPS model manager from Kingsville. Okay. And I flew up to Meridian, and I took a check ride from he was a Navy F-14 guy, and he was the NATOPS model manager, and I had to have the secret NATOPS model manager check ride from that guy, and I don't remember his name. I think he was going to one of the majors. He was leaving the Navy. And so I had prepared for a complete NATOPS check ride. I was going to go up there, and I was not going to embarrass myself. And we take off, and he goes, "All right, you got any questions now?" And he goes, "All right, let's go back." And it was about a 15-minute flight.
Omni VOR.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's the secret handshake. That was the important part.
Exactly.
It was. I had secret channel. I think I only did it for 6 months, and then we were transitioned to the T-45, and I turned it over to somebody else. I don't even remember that part. It was too long ago. I don't even remember what I did yesterday, honestly. But
it was a good excuse for a cross country.
That's right,
gentlemen. I can't tell you how impressed I am to hear the story straight from you guys. I've read about it, and I remember reading it firsthand when it happened, and here you are all these years later, and you guys are both just first class human beings, and I'm proud to claim you as Naval Aviator brothers, and thank you for sharing that with us.
I can't add to that. I'm impressed. Thank you. We're honored that you guys were able to join us. So
thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us on.
Lots of fun.
So, like I say, I can't add anything more to that. Thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen.
Oh my gosh, what a great story.
Absolutely perfect. Yeah. So I want to also thank Dave Hamilton over at Mac Geek Gab. That's the best tech podcast going out there, all things Apple and more. If you want to reach us or have any questions, reach out to fig@sothereiwas.us or repeat@sothereiwas.us. Repeat spelled REPETE. You can also reach us on Facebook and Twitter at sothereiwas.us/Facebook or /Twitter. In the meantime, gentlemen, thank you for your service. Thank you for your professionalism, and check 6.
What happens when I pull a rope, Yogi?
I sail over the wall, the parachute pops open, and old Yogi floats to the ground like a fallen leaf.